Mario, good to see you, and in person this time.
I know, it's great.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming over.
No, I'll always accept an invite to California. You know that.
Yeah, it's good having you here.
So, like I said to you when I wanted to set this up, I really wanted to talk to you as a man of vast experience when it comes to marathon running about preparation for marathons, but not the longitudinal preparation, because when you get close to a marathon, all of that is hopefully done.
Right.
This is more about what do you do in those final few weeks so that you put all of that good work to work on the race day.
Yeah.
So before we get into that, for people that don't know you and your credentials, you know, how many marathons have you run yourself?
I have run 15 marathons myself,
Yeah.
and I have coached numerous runners to marathon finishes, from their first finish lines to Boston qualifiers, Olympic trials qualifiers, and even the Olympic Games.
I was going to say, you've been an Olympic marathon coach, so
Yep.
you know, it's a pretty big accolade.
Yeah, 2012, London, your backyard.
Yeah, you were over for it. And also, just to set the scene as well, so you've coached Olympic marathon runners extremely fast, and as a runner yourself, you're not too shabby. What's your marathon PB at the moment?
2:27:33.
Yeah, so, you know, very, very spicy.
Thank you.
Yeah, so definitely the right person for me to be talking to about this. So what I wanted to do was sort of take us from a few weeks out from the marathon, because I think what happens with everyone knows you've got to put a lot of volume, a lot of mileage in for a marathon, and everyone has an appreciation that towards the race then you've got to taper that off, and there's various other things you've got to do to get to the start line in good shape and then execute your best performance. But where should we start when we start that conversation? Where's that last really big significant training session before you start to phase into race mode?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for me, I like to start roughly 3 weeks out, so 21 days from the race itself. And typically one of two things will happen that weekend. We'll either do our last big marathon specific long run, so that is going to be a longer run, depending on the athlete. It'll be in the range of, you know, could be 18 to 24 miles, depends on their experience level and just how their cycle has gone to that point. But within that run, there will be huge chunks of marathon running. Sometimes we'll do a very long steady state, maybe it's 16 miles or up to 18 miles at marathon effort. Sometimes it's like 3 by 5 miles. Sometimes it's a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 cut down. What that looks like is just going to depend on the athlete and sort of where they are, but it's a very strenuous session. It's very specific to the race itself, and I call that a dress rehearsal. So we are going to try and mimic the race environment and conditions as best we can, starting from even like a day or two before, in terms of like what we're eating, what time we're going to bed the night before, when we get up, what we're doing that morning, all the way to what we're wearing, our racing flats, our kit, making sure that we've got our fueling and we're taking that at the same intervals that we plan to during the race. So that's the most common scenario. The other, and this is less, I would say, popular, but it does happen, is I'll often have an athlete race 3 weeks out, or they'll run a half marathon. And usually within 3 weeks of the race, I don't want to leave the marathon there. So very rarely do I just have them send it for whatever they've got for 13 miles 3 weeks out. But we'll use that as, again, a marathon specific session. So we'll try to do all the same things that I just talked about from a preparatory standpoint. But during the race itself, we'll typically run the first 10 miles at around marathon effort. And then at that 10-mile mark, they've got 5K to go, they make a decision. If they feel really good, they can cut it down a little bit and just crank the pace and finish strong. And if they're just feeling that accumulation of fatigue in the 10, 12 weeks prior to that, and they're already just kind of pushing up against the edge there, we'll just try to maintain marathon effort and get a 13-mile marathon effort run. And very rarely do I have the athlete 3 weeks out race full gas at that point, because we're not trying to PR in the half marathon. Everything is just building toward the race a few weeks later.
Yeah, I guess you leave a lot of, you could do a lot of muscle damage. You could get quite sore and stiff and miss a few more days of training at that point if you went too hard.
Yeah, the risk is high there, but I also think psychologically as well. So if they go in like, I'm just going to crush this half marathon 3 weeks out, and they really get themselves up for it and they do really nail it, it's hard to it's hard to recover from that and come back 3 weeks later. So I really try to keep the big goal in mind, and really what we're trying to do is perform well at the marathon 3 weeks later. So whether it's a race or whether it's that big marathon specific long run, we really just want to treat it as another day and not get like too amped about it. But we do have to respect that it is a huge toll, you know, certainly on your body and all of its physiological systems, but also like psychologically too. It requires like quite a bit of focus to be able to nail that workout. So we really emphasize recovery in the days following that. And that's our last big, as I said, marathon specific long run. We'll still do another big workout or two since we have some time to play with before the race.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got that. So 3 weeks out, either this half marathon or something between 18 and 24 miles with marathon paced efforts. Then you've got a few days where you're obviously recovering from that effort. And then talk to me about what the last 2 weeks look like in terms of tapering, because I know different people approach tapering in very different ways.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's one right way to do it. I think it just depends on the athlete and, again, their experience level and what they respond best to. I have some athletes who respond really well to a 3-week very gradual taper. I have some who are better with like a 10 to 14 day, you know, cutback. But typically after that last big long run or race 3 weeks out, you know, the 3 to 4 days after that will really emphasize recovery, keep the intensity super low, make sure that we're fueling well so we can restock glycogen stores, you know, do a body check, make sure that, you know, there's no little niggles or injuries or anything that are going to turn into something bigger and problematic at that point. Sometime during that week, usually like Thursday-ish, we'll do just a very light, I don't even want to call it leg speed workout, but just light turnover workout, 1 minute pickups, maybe some cruising 400s, nothing that's super stressful, but, you know, just to turn the legs over, get the wheel spinning a little bit, take another day or two easy after that. And then we'll do our last like long run in terms of, you know, volume 2 weeks out. And again, like how long that run is going to vary depending on the athlete and who they are and how they respond to these types of things. But, you know, typically that's in that like, you know, 18 to 22, you know, mile range, but time on feet. So while you're out there for a while, the intensity is nowhere near as high as the week before. So it's not, it shouldn't at that point, if you're well trained, take quite as much out of you. And that's the last, you know, long, like 2+ hour day that we'll have. And that gets us to 2 weeks before race day.
Yeah. So 2 weeks out, you've got this last long run. The last 2 weeks, do you work to any sort of approximate formula for how much you cut the volume or the intensity or both down in that last 2 weeks? Is it kind of fairly linear? Does it go up and down? How does that work?
Yeah, so 3 weeks out, we're at full volume. We're at 100% of, you know, where we've been over the course of that entire cycle. 2 weeks out, again, this is going to depend on the athlete. I have some who are still at 100%. The distribution of the intensity of that week is different than the week before, but volume-wise, we'll keep it up there. We'll keep the frequency of their runs up. Some athletes will start cutting back there. So, you know, that 2 weeks out, you know, we've already dialed it back 10 or 15%. After that last long run 2 weeks out, we're going to cut 20% off. So that's going to get us to a week out from race day, and then typically I'll cut another 10% off of that the week leading into the race.
But you're still doing 70% of your, so if you were to use easy maths, if you were doing a 100-mile week or a 100-kilometre week, you're still going to run 70 or so in that final week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, we've gotten ourselves to 2 weeks out. We've done that last, you know, long run, and now we're going to start dialing things back. A big thing for me in the last 2 to 3 weeks before the marathon is not to do anything drastically differently. Yes, we are cutting back the volume. We're going to keep intensity in the mix. I like to maintain the rhythm of our typical weeks because I think when you've been training for, you know, 10, 12, 14, 16 weeks for a marathon, you get used to that cycle, and you get used to doing, like, you know, Tuesday, Wednesday workout, and then maybe a Friday, Saturday workout, weekend long run, and body craves consistency. So we want to make sure that we don't deviate too far from that, but that we're also being very careful not to go over the edge so close to race day. Because, you know, within 2 weeks, I think from a physiological standpoint, we're really not going to gain that much that's going to help us on race day, but we could really screw it up if we're not careful. So we'll do that last long run 2 weeks out. We'll take a couple easy days after that. Again, it's not going to require quite as much as the one from the week before. 10 days out is when I like to do our last big interval session. And what that looks like is going to differ depending on the athlete. Typically, it's somewhere in the range of 8 to 12K worth of intervals. We may do 800s, we may do Ks, we may do miles, we may do 2 miles, some combination of that, typically around like 10K to half marathon effort. Somewhere in that, somewhere in that range. So that's some, that's some hefty work, but again, something you should be able to handle if you've had a good training cycle up to that point. And we still have enough time, from that workout to race day to like really, really recover from that. But that's 10 days out. That's our last significant session. Then everything else from, there on in is easy running and just what I call like refresher workouts, just enough to make sure that we're staying engaged and again, maintaining the rhythm of our typical week.
Yeah, it makes total sense. So one thing I think that all as athletes struggle with in the taper phase is like, you're obviously very focused on the race. It's the psychology of how you feel every session, and suddenly how you feel becomes incredibly important. Even if you're pretty good normally at kind of shrugging off a bad workout or something like that. If you have a bad workout or you just feel lethargic or lousy in the final 5 or 6 days, that can be psychologically damaging. How first of all, how have you felt in your tapers before different races, and then what do you tell your athletes about that?
I think the clinical diagnosis is the taper crazies, is what they call them. We all get them at some point, and I mean certainly the closer you get to the race, the more heightened your senses are. I mean, but that can even start 2 weeks out, because then you realize, oh, all right, this is happening, and like we're in it now. Like there's not really much that I can do. There's no makeup training that you can do to get yourself ready for the race, and depending on how well your cycle's gone, I think affects how you're going to feel about where you're at heading into the race. So if you've had a very consistent and solid training cycle, you get within 2 weeks, sometimes you feel pretty good. You're like, okay, like everything's gone really well. I have confidence. If you've had a bumpier road, I think that's when, you can really start to have those self-doubts and start questioning, is there more that I should have done? Is there more that I can do? How is this going to go? So managing that is crucial in, I would say, the 2 weeks leading up to the race. And I encourage my athletes all the time to look back at their training log and realize that if you had one bad workout, you had one bad race, or a couple bad workouts and races, we all do, that's okay. Like, was the overall consistency good? How did you bounce back from that? What did you learn from it? And just looking at, the accumulation of all of that at training and taking confidence from it and realizing there's no one workout, even that big workout 3 weeks out, that doesn't guarantee how your race is going to go. It gives us some good information, but you haven't decided your fate on that day. So don't put too much stock in any one workout, but see how they all fit together over the course of the cycle, and take some confidence from that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, try and look at it in general. Don't look at it too specifically. That's what I was always told. It's like, look at how much you've done. Look back through those, flick through the training logs, and just look at the weekly mileages and those kind of things. And take a bit of heart from that.
Yeah, and to take that even a step further, the marathon itself is just one day. So if you've been training for 100+ days for this marathon, even the marathon itself is one day. And obviously you want it to go well. You've put all of this work in, but I think it's important to remind yourself throughout the training cycle, especially in those last few weeks, that it's not about any one day. It's about how did this training cycle as a whole come together, and what did I learn from it, but also what did I experience that I enjoyed? How did I grow? The race itself is not pass-fail. I mean, you may have made other advancements during the course of that training cycle that you weren't able to do previously. Maybe you finally got the fueling aspect of things right. Maybe you stayed healthy for the first time. Maybe you're able to nail tempo runs for the first time where you've struggled with those in the past. So I think it's recognizing those wins along the way and realizing the progress that you've made before you even step to the start line. And I think in my own experience, and even with the athletes that I coach, sometimes that can help to really just calm those, those butterflies that are there on race day, where we all just put that pressure on ourselves to make it all about this one day. And if it goes well, I mean, 99% of us are already looking on to the next thing anyway. And if it doesn't, it's like, oh my God, it's a total failure. It's like, don't think that way. Think a little bit more holistically.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that feel like I've got better as I've got older as an athlete, is like taking a little bit of joy from the fact that what the marathon did, or what the thing you were training for did, was it got your ass out of bed every day for a while and made you push yourself a little bit harder, and you took you out your comfort zone.
And I think that comes with experience and age and getting more of these under your belt and realizing what it's really about. I mean, speaking for myself and my own experience, last year, 2023, I ran the Boston Marathon. It was my sixth Boston. And it wasn't my fastest. It was the best I've ever executed Boston, which was great. The most memorable part of the whole thing for me had very little to do with the race itself. It was the 3 months prior. I had two of my best friends and training partners, Levi and Fernando. We did most of our long runs together. We did a lot of workouts together. We shared some really cool moments during the training cycle. We went to the start line together on race day. We tried to run together as much as possible during the race. And we didn't all finish at the same time, but we all got together immediately after the finish line and hobbled back to the hotel together. And I'll remember all of that more than I do the time that's next to my name at the end.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I mean, I came and joined you and Fernando actually for one of your final training runs, I think.
A year ago, yeah.
And it was like, you could tell there was a buzz with you guys, like all getting together and enjoying that, even though you were working hard, it's like, it was fun.
Yeah, and that's what I'll remember more than whatever the result ended up being on the day, because that's what's going to last.
Yeah. If I change it up now, Mo, and ask you a more technical question about marathon pace. So how do you go about determining marathon pace with an athlete based on training sessions? Like, what are the key sessions, and then how do you get them to manage pace on the day? And then secondary to that, obviously, a lot of marathons are fairly consistent, flat and fast, so it's kind of easy to work out. But how do you adjust if someone's like training in the cold and they're going to a hot marathon, or training on the flat largely, but they're going to have to go and run a hilly marathon? Or how does that play?
I'm going to start with the second part of that question first, because I'm a big effort guy. Everything we do, we lead with effort, and then I will put, whether it's pace, heart rate, some other measurable parameters, just as points of reference for them to check along the way. But effort needs to lead the way, especially if you're training through the winter for a spring marathon, because more often than not, it's cold, it can be very, very windy. We all know as we get deep into a marathon cycle and that fatigue accumulates, you know, what marathon pace feels like on one day is not going to feel very similar to how it does the next day. So I think it's important to really get in tune with effort and understand what that feels like at different points, when you're fresh, when you're fatigued. And then along with that, and this is a little more gradual and can evolve over time, is understanding what your numbers are relative to that. So if you're running marathon effort fairly fresh on flat ground, what does that look like more often than not in some of those key sessions? Over hilly ground, how does that terrain affect it? You know, in colder conditions, what adjustments do you have to make? In warmer conditions, what adjustments do you have to make? So I think that is something where you have, you know, tune-up races and then also key workouts, a lot of the ones that are more specific to the marathon itself. So those long marathon pace tempo runs, half marathon type of efforts, and races. And there are a number of equivalency charts that you can look at that says, hey, if I raced a half marathon in around this time, what is my predicted marathon pace?
I was going to ask you about those specifically, because, you know, I look at those when especially if I've knocked out a decent 5K, I'm kind of going online and go, I wonder what I could do a marathon in based on that. Do you rate them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking here. I have like Daniel's running formula, right? So this is a popular one, and they have, you know, online you could just use the calculator. It's a lot easier. But you know, he has these equivalency charts here. So you know, it's like if you have a half marathon and you can run, you know, 1:34:53. You know, the equivalent is 3:17. You know, 29. So if you've done a half marathon or two in the, you know, 10 to 12 weeks leading up to your race, you know, you can use those as check-ins and as a way to really start to dial in the marathon pace that you want to hit for some of those bigger workouts, and then even the race itself. So that'll get you in the ballpark. But I think as well, you have to be okay with failing at some point during the training cycle. And failing is maybe not the best word to use, but it's the best one that I can think of right now, where you try to run a certain pace during a workout and you either find out that it was too easy and you need to go a little bit faster next time. More often than not, you probably went a little too quick and burned out and need to make an adjustment on the other end. So I would say look at those key, you know, marathon specific types of workouts, the ones that have marathon pace built into them, even half marathon pace. For most people, it's, depending on your physiology, it could be 10 seconds a mile slower. It could be up to 20 seconds a mile slower. But that can give you just a good point of reference to use when you're trying to dial that in for yourself.
Yeah.
But again, like, focus on the effort, because if you're running Boston, how you approach that from a pacing standpoint is going to be very different than how you approach London, which is a much flatter and more consistent course.
And just to totally clarify for everyone, when you talk about effort, you're talking about that perceived effort of how you feel. So you're encouraging people to really tune in and listen to their body, as opposed to saying they're going to sit on a time that their GPS watch tells them.
Yeah, and that involves checking in with yourself over the course of these runs, these races, these workouts, and asking, can I sustain this level of effort, this level of intensity for 3 hours, 3.5 hours, whatever your rough marathon time is. I think thing with the marathon is generally you can, for the most part, ballpark within a few minutes where you should be. So if you're checking in with yourself during these longer efforts and just really being honest with yourself whether or not that effort is sustainable, that's going to give you a lot of good information. And there are studies that have shown that RPE, rate of perceived exertion, it's as good of an arbiter of effort and intensity as any other metric that you can be given.
Totally agree with that. I think especially if you build up the experience around it.
And that's it. Experience goes a long way. I've been training and racing competitively for 27 years. So mine's pretty well dialed at this point. Someone who's only been doing it for a few years, they're going to need to get, like, literally and figuratively get more reps in and just really understand what that effort feels like, run a few marathons, run different types of marathons, really keep a copious training log so that you can, just note over time, how that's changed, how that's progressed, what those numbers look like relative to that perceived effort.
No, it makes total sense.
Can I flip it on you real quick for a second?
Yeah.
So within the last 3 weeks of a marathon, one of the most common questions that I get from my athletes has to do with nutrition.
Yeah.
So, we are, as we just discussed, dialing back volume and, like, the density of our workouts quite a bit over those last few weeks. And the question I get is, should I be doing the same thing with my day-to-day nutrition?
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because there's few things pushing and pulling in that area. One of them is obviously we need to fuel and hydrate to fuel and cover the work you're going to do and recover from that work. But at the same time, if you are tapering down the intensity and the volume, then your overall calorie burn is going to be lower. So if you were having to eat a huge amount of food to support that training load before, should you necessarily carry on eating like that in those final 2 weeks? Because what you don't want to be doing is putting on a couple of pounds in the last 2 weeks. No one wants that. I think opinions have probably shifted around on that over the years. Like, I think if you went back a few years, people were way more concerned about being as light as possible. And I think that it's well documented, that got to a very unhealthy level, and probably still exists at an unhealthy level with a lot of runners. So I would say you're going to be, if you're following the program that you're suggesting, where you're still doing 80% and 70% of the work that's required in those last 2 weeks, then you're pretty much going to be eating the same, really. I would certainly say as well, those big simulation training sessions that you talked about, the 3 weeks out, the 2 weeks out, you'll have done this before, hopefully, but they're huge for getting your fueling and hydration absolutely nailed. So dinner the night before is the same, or roughly the same. Breakfast is identical, and the identical amount of time before the start. Your pre-hydration routine, the gel you have before the start, how many gels or bottles of drink you're going to have, all of that just needs to be baked in. And I would say even if you're running 20, let's say you're running 22 miles, I would fuel that like I was running 26, because the more you can fuel and hydrate, the more quickly you're going to recover. So I wouldn't say, and it depends, I guess, on whether you're someone who eats kind of intuitively, or whether you're someone who eats in a way more structured way. Like, I eat very intuitively. Like, I'll listen to my body, and I've got confidence from doing that. And I went into a race 4 weeks ago, which was it was an important race to me. It wasn't an important race, but I went into it, and I really kept my fueling and hydration up in the days leading in, even though I was tapering down and stuff, because it was a race without any aid stations. I was kind of scared. It was an hour and 45 of effort, it's a 14-mile cross country. And I was like, I've got to be strong for this, not on the light side. And I weighed in before it, and I was a little bit shocked, because I was testing my sweat rate, and I was a little bit shocked. I'm like 2.5 kilos, so like 4 pounds heavier than I expected to be, which in the moment is like, well, that's a bit shocking, but actually felt really strong, had a really good run, and ran a quicker time than I did 4 years ago when I was 3 or 4 pounds lighter. So my personal opinion has shifted much more, I think, towards being strong rather than not.
My own N of 1 is very consistent with that. I mean, I, in the past, call it 4 years, have really tried to make sure that I am well fueled in those last couple of weeks leading into the race. And I don't weigh myself, but I don't change my eating at all. But I mean, it's pretty easy math. If your volume goes down and you're maintaining the same amount of calories, like that ratio is going to be different. But what I've noticed is my energy levels are higher, I sleep better, I recover a lot quicker, and then I perform better. And that's really what it's about at the end of the day for me. And I've seen that with a lot of my athletes as well. And I don't think that's an uncommon occurrence, but getting people to take that step and really trust that, okay, this is going to be okay. And actually, not only is it going to be okay, I'm probably going to perform better because of it. Can be challenging sometimes.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think working with athletes who ask this question a lot, we try to use language around in those final 2 weeks about making sure that people are eating to recover, to be robust, to be resilient, that sort of thing. And don't talk about weight. Don't talk about try and turn that conversation into something which has a positive connotation, rather than like, oh, maybe you shouldn't be eating quite as much because maybe you're going to be a little heavy there. It's like, well, let's put the fuel in because that's going to make us more resilient and more robust.
I think I'm going to borrow those 3 R's from you: recover, resilient, robust.
Yeah,
I like that.
It's a good way of. I think it's a good way of setting in people's minds that this is the reason for, not skimping on the food, basically.
Yeah.
So Mario, we're now effectively in our little chronological timeline. We're a few days out from the race. Now, marathons, particularly big city marathons, are quite a logistical challenge, obviously for the organisers, but even for the individual. You've usually got a whole load of you need to have special bags to put in places. You need to get on public transportation to get to a certain place before the start. You need to know which, if it's London Marathon, there's different starts you've got to get to. Tell me about your experiences of how you've kind of dialed and dealt with that with 15 marathons. You must have come across them all.
Yeah, and I'll even add to that just the travel to the race itself, because more often than not, in most of the marathons that I've run, I've traveled not to all of them, but most of them. And so backing out a few days from the race, most of the marathons are on Sunday, so that is going to be race day. Working backwards from there, I'll usually travel on a Friday, typically for a Sunday race, sometimes on Thursday, but typically Friday. And depending on the travel, if I'm going to take a day off, it's usually that day, because the travel takes all day, or I get in late and squeezing a run in isn't going to benefit me as much as resting at that point. So I'll typically, take that day off. And then next day is Saturday. Always do a shakeout myself, encourage my athletes to do a little shakeout, 20 to 30 minutes max, just enough to move the body, especially if you didn't do anything the day before. But also, I think that helps to calm some of the nerves. The morning of, depending where you are, everyone else could be doing their shakeout as well. And sometimes it's also just fun to be a part of that energy. But what I will try to do as much as possible, if I can get to the expo on Friday, if travel allows for that, I like to just take care of getting my bib and all of that stuff as soon as I possibly can. So I'll try to do that on Friday if possible. If not, I'll do that on Saturday. And for me, because I've run so many marathons and I also work in this industry, I've been to every expo under the sun. I get in and I get out. I don't walk the floor. I don't sample all the foods. No offense to all the brands out there. If you all set up at a booth, I'm moving by. I'm just trying to get in and out of there. As quickly as I can. What I will do is plan ahead as well. So I typically will book dinner reservations for, that Saturday night. If I'm not going to eat in my own hotel room, I try to identify where the grocery store is so that I can go there and get what I need. If I haven't brought it myself, I usually do need to get something. That way, much like we have rehearsed in the weeks prior, I know exactly what it is I'm going to be eating, when I'm going to be eating it, and I just try to control the things that that I can control. And then usually what I'll do that Saturday is just chill out and watch some mindless movies on the TV, or I'll read something at some point. in the afternoon or after dinner, I might just go out for a short walk just to, burn off some energy and move my body a little bit, but nothing too strenuous or, or too long. And then I just put myself into the routine that I've been in for the last, several weeks leading up to this race, and try to, again, be as consistent as possible with that, because I think with that consistency comes comfortability as well. And I think when you're in a new city, it's easy to feel just like discombobulated and out of your routine. But if you control what you can control and just try to stick to the schedule, I think there's a comfort that comes from that. And I really try to just emphasize that as much as I can.
Yeah. So you're not going shopping for a new bargain pair of shoes the day before then?
No, it's all, that stuff is all settled well in advance of me getting to the race site.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that one thing that I always used to do, still do if I'm taking something really seriously, is have a checklist as well. Especially when I'm packing before I leave, I'm big on having a physical checklist of just like the important stuff. I mean, being a triathlete back in the day, that was even more important because you had a lot of bike
There's
stuff.
a lot more stuff.
There's a lot more stuff. But even with a marathon these days, you want your nutrition, you're going to have your shoes, potentially a spare pair of your best running socks and all those kind of things. So
and I do like have those contingency plans in place. I have backups of everything in case I forgot something. I make sure that I'm not putting myself in panic mode the day before the race, and then the night before I'll lay everything out. I've got my bib is on my singlet, that is, my kit is laid out, so I don't have to go digging around for it. It's like, okay, I get up, I get dressed, I go to the bathroom, my breakfast is usually laid out, or it's, if I have a little yogurt, which I'll sometimes do, like that's in the refrigerator, coffee machine is ready to go. I've just got everything ready, and I know what time I'm getting up, and I know what time I want to leave, and I know how I'm getting to the shuttle. I've researched this ahead of time, and I think a little planning in the weeks and days leading up to the race, as far as those logistics are concerned, go a long way toward having just a seamless morning on race day. And for me, of the marathons I've run, Boston is the one that I've run the most. I've run 6 times. So for me, I have experience with that particular race. And this is not uncommon for a lot of marathoners. There's people who try to do Boston every year, or they try to do New York every year, or they do London every year, or Paris every year, whatever it happens to be. If you're doing a race for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, however many time, use that to your advantage and be able to just like maybe stay in the same place and like know exactly what grocery store you're going to and all of those things. And again, there's a comfortability that comes from that consistency. So, I always try to keep that in mind too, and when I'm traveling and going somewhere for a race.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Be organised, be pre-planned, and get it all wired. What about, so a few quick fire ones for you then, just on some super specifics. I know everyone's a bit different, but let's talk about you here.
Okay.
Like, how many hours before the marathon do you have your breakfast?
I will eat my breakfast 4 hours before the start.
Yeah. And how much warming up do you do, running and jogging wise, before a marathon?
1 mile.
Yeah, that's it.
1 mile.
Yeah, and how fast do you run that?
Very slowly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I will do some strides. So I do a little faster running. So I'll do 4 to 6 by 20-second strides, either along with that mile, usually afterward, and not super fast, but just enough to kind of get my legs up to speed. And 2 reasons for that. I think you want to do some kind of warm up. Usually to just be completely honest, it helps me to go to the bathroom for the last time. I mean, that's probably the biggest reason that I'll warm up that mile, but it does start to get the blood flowing, and I do that before every workout. I do that before every other race, so it just puts me in the right mindset that, hey, I'm here to do this thing. But a mile is enough to not take away from the marathon, because again, the energy expenditure of the marathon is so huge. I don't want to waste that much extra energy if I can get away with it. So a mile is enough for me, and then that also is enough to encourage me to use the first few miles of the race. I'm not going that slow. I'm trying to get on my marathon pace, but as a bit of a warm-up. So I'll start usually a little slower than whatever my goal pace is, and just kind of use those first few miles to get myself up to speed and then build momentum from there. And that strategy has worked out really, really well for me.
Yeah, and how long before the start do you aim to sort of finish that mile And as in, like, is that 30 minutes before the start?
It depends when I need to get into the corral, but typically between 30 and 45 minutes before the start, depending on the race. The smaller races, you can usually just sneak into the corral in the last few minutes. Bigger ones like Boston, I've never done London, but I assume pretty similar just with the number of people there. You've probably got to be in there at 20 to 30, if not 40 minutes before. So I know all that ahead of time, but you know, I will just try to time it so I have enough time to go to the restroom, you know, shed my last layers and get in there before the start.
Yeah, cool. So I've got a specific example for you that I'll tell you first here. I did a race, triathlon, half Ironman many years ago, which was a big race for me. It was a home race. Half Ironman had recently come to the UK. I don't think I was racing as a pro then, but I was hoping to sort of do really well in my age group. And it was back in the days when all athletes would start together. And if you were prepared to muscle your way to the front, you could like start with the pros. And I was there to prove something to myself and probably anyone else. I thought to other people as well, but they weren't so interested. But we got to the start, we're in our wetsuits, waiting to go, and there's mist on the lake. It's very unusual, just the climatic conditions meant there's a very low fog on the lake, and they kept delaying the start. Another 5 minutes, another 5 minutes. It gets to about 30 minutes, and then they say the start's going to be like another 45 minutes to give everyone a bit of a break. And I remember, I didn't know, I had not accounted for this. I don't think anyone had accounted for this. This didn't happen. It wasn't expected to happen with the things. So it was an interesting experience for me because I didn't know how I was going to handle it. And what I immediately heard was people around me like freaking out and really losing their heads. And for whatever reason, I'm not claiming any sort of like great mental resilience here, but that made me go, well, I'm going to be fine with this. This is all right. I'll just have a chill for a bit. And I found my dad was watching and managed to find him. He managed to find me a cup of tea from somewhere and like passed it through the barriers. And I just kind of sat quietly and I had a breakthrough race. And I'm sure a lot of people, it fried their heads and caused a lot of people not to have a good race.
I'm not surprised.
So when things don't go right in that very immediate build-up before a marathon, like something it's usually going to be like something logistical, like your shoelace snaps or something stresses you out or you miss the shuttle, or like how do you deal with that? How does an athlete deal with that?
Keep calm and carry on. I think that's the biggest thing is you need to be able to just have that emotional control. I think that's so important in racing anyway, but certainly in the days leading up to and day of the race. So to give a personal example, somewhat similar to that, Boston Marathon 2018, weather was miserable. That was the year that Yuki won, Des won. A lot of folks dropped out. A lot of people had hypothermia. It was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, cold, rain, and very, very high winds. And most people were freaking out in the days before the race. I heard it from my own athletes who were racing, and I knew before we stepped to the start line who was going to have a solid day and who wasn't. And I raced that day. And for me, I grew up in New England. I'm used to running in terrible weather. I trained through a wet winter here in California, and I was like, this is great. I'm like, this is great. I can't wait. I mean, that was one of the best marathons I've ever run. And I think a lot of it was, I prepared well leading up to it, but I didn't let the weather rattle me. And then the second part of what you need to do in addition to keep calm and carry on is control what you can control. And you can control your emotions in those moments and how you respond to whatever the situation is, the race start being delayed, the weather conditions, etc. You need to be able to control that. And the folks who can are typically the ones who are not going to be bothered by whatever the interruption was. You know, so I think just keeping those two simple things in mind, like keep calm and carry on, and then control what you can control. That's going to get you a long way. But you see it. You know, you see the people who are just kind of losing their mind, and it's like their race is over before it even started, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that I was able to take heart from seeing the people do that. And I think what it was, when I reflect back on it, it was like I almost felt embarrassed for them the way that they were handling this situation. It was like, this is not a big deal, guys. You know, but the fact that you're making it a big deal is going to make me double down on kind of not making it a big deal.
Yeah, and I think it's important to practice those things in training as much as you can. I do this with athletes that I'm able to, meet for workouts. Sometimes I'll just throw some curveball at them because I think it's important to practice how you're going to deal with those situations when things don't go your way. And I think as endurance athletes, like, if we go all the way back to the beginning of the training cycle, we want it to follow this very logical and linear progression. I do this and that leads to this and that leads to this and that leads to this, and these things all fit together perfectly, and it becomes very predictable. And okay, I'm going to step on the line, I'm going to go bop, 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 bop. And that's just not how it works. We're not robots. We have to be able to be present and respond to whatever is happening on the day, whatever curveballs get thrown our way, and trust ourselves to make the decision that we need to make to set ourselves up for success.
Yeah, well said. All good. So we've started the marathon now. Let's get into that piece. So you've done your mile warm up.
Yep.
The gun's gone off. You talk about getting into. We know what our pace, approximately what pace we're aiming for is. Let's talk about pacing the marathon, because for me, that is one of the keys to success. That is one of the biggest things. The easiest way to ruin a marathon is in the first 10K.
Yep.
So yeah.
And it doesn't matter what marathon it is. I think that holds true. It holds especially true at races like Boston, where you have a significant downhill in the first 5K, and you can just really beat up your body by going out too fast. But I mean, I look at what the best in the world do, and I can't comprehend running 4:45 marathon pace. Most 99.9% of people can't. But if you just strip that out of it and you look at how they execute the race, whether it's a course like Boston, which is not a place that people go to try and run a time, especially at the front, they're competing to win, there's no pacemakers, or London, where there are multiple pace groups, it's a very flat course, you can run a very even rhythm. The folks at the front of the field, 99% of the time, and I think this still holds true, every world record that's ever been set in the marathon, or at least 99% of them, have been even or negative split. And even at Boston, where the first half and the second half aren't equal, and it can get windier more often than not, unless there's like crazy wind coming off of the water and you just can't maintain your pace going into that, the top folks run even or negative splits. And most amateur age group athletes do not. And that has very little to do, I think, with their ability level. I think it has a lot to do with their inability to trust themselves and be patient early on when everyone's taken off and there's a sense of urgency to try and get up with the pace group or to be on pace, right away. And that's why I try for myself. Some of it is practical, but some of it is also psychological, where the first 2 miles of the race, I intend to start a little bit slower than whatever my goal pace is, even if it's a flat course or it's downhill, because a couple things happen. One, I know that I'll be able to build momentum after that. If I lose 5 seconds a mile in the first, call it 5K, I can make up those 15 seconds over the course of the next 23 miles. Not that big of a deal. And I keep that in mind when I'm there. But also psychologically, it just takes some of the pressure off, where you're like, oh my God, I was 2 seconds slow. It's like, you have 25 miles to go. You're going to be okay. That type of thing. So I really try to, stay as relaxed as I possibly can early on in the race, because as the race goes on, if you are executing it well, the last 10K is really, really hard. Someone told me once before my first marathon, I was asking whoever I could for advice. They said there's 2 halves of the marathon, first 20 miles and the last 10K. And I really took that to heart, and I believe that to be true. I think that's where your long run ends, and that's where racing begins. And it doesn't mean it's easy to that point, but you've got to stay controlled and patient, because that last 10K, it's going to require, you to either stay on pace or get a little bit faster. 2, your fuel stores are probably pretty low at that point, and even if you're able to pound a gel, you're probably running a little bit low on gas. So you've got that aspect of things happening, but mentally too, you've really just got to focus on every step. And I think if you have really drained that tank, that kind of emotional well early on in the race, and there's nothing left for the last 10K, it doesn't matter how fit you are or what, like you're just not going to be able to do it. So it's really like rationing those reserves, you know, kind of along the way. But I think a lot of it starts in the first like 5 to 10K and just not ruining your race there. I've said this in other interviews before, I've written articles about it. I don't know that I've ever had an athlete come to me after the marathon and say, I wish I had started a little bit faster.
Yeah, very true.
But I can't tell you how many have come to me and said, yeah, I wish I had backed off just a little bit more, like that first half.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with all of that. I think that what I've said to people and what I say to myself when I do a long race, be it a marathon or whatever, is that first chunk of the race, let's say in a marathon, the first 5K in particular, that sets the tone for the race for you. And it's very hard. It's like if you go out a little bit hard, it's very hard at that point to even then back off a little bit. It's kind of because you've kind of set the tone and you're a little bit up on your splits, and that feels good because we all love, in our head, we love banking a bit of time and thinking, if I want to run 3 hours, if I can go through that halfway in 1:29, I've just got a minute to spare, you know. And it's like, no, you haven't. No, you've burned some matches to do that. You probably were better off going through in 30:30. 1:30:30, and then stripping it back. So I think there's that. So I really talk to people about focusing on that first, even if it's the first mile, the first 2 miles, because if you can set the tone right, the battle's half won. And then the other thing is as well, to your point about running to effort rather than pace or whatever, I actually switch it up a lot in a long race, and early on I'll run to pace rather than effort, because effort can feel very skewed.
Sure.
If you're tapered, carb loaded, full of adrenaline, slightly downhill, tailwind, whatever, suddenly the kind of the 6 minutes a mile that you were doing in training, there was a bit of a slog because you're a bit tired and that kind of thing, like you're skipping along at 5:50 going, this is easy. And it's just remembering it's not true.
This happened to me at Boston last year. I had a great training cycle. I felt really good going into the race, and I'd run that race 5 times prior, so I knew what I was in for, and I knew, and I'd done it really well, and I'd done it poorly, but I knew what I needed to do to have a successful day. And I thought, best case scenario, if everything's clicking, you know, the weather's cooperating, I feel good. I'm like, I could possibly like break 2:30 here. But I also had enough experience to know that I couldn't force that to happen if it wasn't the day for it. So, you know, I went out and I was I think I was like 5:51, so I was like 6 seconds back of, you know, 2:30 pace, you know, at that point. And it's a downhill mile. Second mile was pretty close to, you know, to the same, and that's kind of where I wanted to be. But even for, like, I thought about my effort to run those splits. I was like, this is a little higher than I want it to be. I'm like, this may not be like a 2:30 type of day. And I let a few more miles go on, and I realized by probably 5 miles into the race that, you know, this is not likely to be a 2:30 type of day for me. And if I try to force myself there, it's going to get really ugly, you know, toward the end. And I accepted that. I listened to my body. I just focused on the effort. I ended up running like 2:34.0, and I ran almost dead even splits, like they're pretty close to dead even splits at Boston, which is tricky to do. The second half is, you know, a lot harder. And I was racing, but I felt like I was racing the last 5 miles of the marathon. And I was just passing people left and right. I maybe got a little faster, like maybe 3 seconds a mile faster, but I was essentially maintaining what I had been doing, you know, kind of up to that point. But if you play the percentages, most of the people are coming back, and that felt so good. To just be able to like roll past people there. And it wasn't easy. I mean, I was at my limit, and that's what I had, you know, for that day, but I was really proud of that execution. And I share that because I see this with some athletes that I coach and just people that I know. And there seems to be this level of like pride or bravado with a lot of marathoners where they're like, yeah, I'm gonna kind of like crash and burn type of thing. Like I'm gonna run this pace as long as I can, and then I'm just gonna hold on with whatever's left. And that's just poor execution, I think. Like if you execute well and those splits look pretty even, that doesn't mean that it's like it's easy necessarily. It just means you've spread yourself out, you know, a lot better over the course of the race, and it's a funner way to run a marathon.
Definitely, No, it's the reliable way to do it, isn't it? I mean, 1 in 100 times going out hard and hanging on works, but there's 99 other occasions when it doesn't.
Yeah, and I'll just leave it at this. If the best in the world aren't trying to bank time, there's no reason that you should be trying to bank time.
Very true.
End of story.
Yeah. Got one more bit for you.
Okay.
Fueling and hydration. What have you learned over the course of 15 marathons and watching people do it? So take us right back to Mario Marathon number 1 or 2.
Sure. I mean, even probably all the way to marathon number 9 or so, I was convinced that I couldn't take much during a marathon. And to be fair, and you know this better than anyone, sports nutrition products in the early 2000s versus what they are now, it was a complete world of difference. And it was hard to take gels because they didn't sit in my stomach. And it could be a point of pride, at least in my circles, and I think this went certainly at the time in like higher level running circles of not taking a lot and thinking that you could do it on very little. I would run those marathons on maybe like a gel and a half and like a couple sips of water.
Which if you would wind back into the 60s, 70s, 80s would have been considered a lot.
Yeah, would have,
because they were all about like the Ron Hill days of carb loading. Carb loading was not, it was seen as a performance hack, but it was seen as a performance hack to allow you not to eat during the race.
Yeah, and so I didn't practice that in training. And I remember, I mean, I was in my early to mid 20s at this time, and I was fairly fit, but I was just destroyed all the time. Like I would be wrecked from my long runs because I'd just be finishing so depleted. I would be so depleted after the race, like, you know, aside from the toll on my body that the course took, because I was so inadequately fueled, like I was just like a zombie for for days afterward. And it really wasn't until 2018 when I started accepting that I needed to eat and drink more during a marathon, and I needed to just get over myself, really, mostly in training, and also during like race day, and the excuses that I was using why I couldn't do this. This is a common one. My long runs, I didn't want to be inconvenienced by carrying a bottle or having to plant bottles or run loops of a certain place. I got over that. I just started, and part of the reason I got over it is I started running ultras for a few years, and I got used to carrying a handheld, and I was like, well, this isn't so bad. So I would just carry a handheld with me, and then I started doing that during the marathons itself, because it is really hard to get what you need off of a table in a marathon. So you have to learn to be self-sufficient. And that made a big difference for me. And then again, the products got better. So I started experimenting with different products, and I was just able to tolerate more. And some of that just came, some of it came almost right away, but a lot of it just came with training and just practicing during long runs. And all of a sudden I notice, oh, I've got better energy during these long runs. But the biggest thing for me was I was coming out of them a lot better. And the same thing with the races where I fueled really, really well. Yeah, I feel like I ran a marathon the next day, but I'm also just not completely depleted. And like I said earlier, as a zombie walking around a couple of days later, and I bounced back, so much quicker. And I mean, so if we look at my early marathons, I got down, call it a gel and a half, so in water, so 150 calories. Let's round up 200 calories, during the entire race. And then if I go to Boston last year, and we did do a case study with you guys at Precision Fuel and Hydration that maybe we can link to along with this. I mean, so before the race started, 15 minutes before, take a gel. Yeah. Or actually the equivalent of a gel, which I was using the chews before the race, I used the gels during. I start the race with a bottle, and I have, Precision Fuel in my bottle. Yeah,
so I was just going to, because I was going to get you to mention that, which you have done anyways. Like, that's pretty unusual, I think, to actually, most people will think, oh, I'm not going to start with a bottle, I'm going to pick one up later on, but you're actually starting with a bottle. And what's the thought process behind that?
Well, I'm probably not going to be able to pick one up later on, that being the biggest thing, but just to get myself off to a good start. The second part being the early water stations at a marathon are very crowded as well. So I wanted to make sure that even if, as the race goes on, I'm not able to get in quite as much, I'm at least getting myself off to a good start. And if you can do that, you've set yourself up for, success later in the race.
And that's not just water, is it? That's a carbohydrate drink or a carbon electrolyte drink?
It was Precision Fuel. So, 100 what's one serving? 30 grams of carbohydrate, 120 calories or so. So I would drink that down over the first 45 minutes, and then like clockwork, I would just take a gel every 30 minutes. And some people do it by mileage. I think time's a bit more universal, and I'm like, I want to get at least 2 gels an hour. So that first hour is kind of front loading things because I got the bottle and I got 2 gels, and then I'm essentially switching to water after that, and I'm still getting 2 gels down per hour. And then I have had a couple marathons where I've been fortunate to grab like a late bottle from someone, and that has, again, precision fuel in it. So it's like I'm kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone there, where I'm getting in the fluids that I need, but calories and carbohydrates, and even some electrolytes as well. Like I'm a fairly like moderate sweater. I'm not heavy, so that's not a huge concern for me. But if it is for you, like that's something that you also need to address, because I've seen that ruin a lot of people's marathons. Yeah,
especially if it's hot and humid. I mean, a lot of spring marathons are obviously hopefully cooler and more temperate conditions.
Yeah, but they can be all over the place.
If you're running the Honolulu Marathon and you're a big sweater, it's a different game. Yeah, it sounds like that's all dialed in.
Yeah, and it's made a huge difference. I mean, being able to fuel myself well, like during training too, because that's where these things accumulate, and these gains happen. It's like helped my recoverability and ability to just like bounce back and do the next session, really well. But then I come into race day and like I've just got a full tank, and then I'm able to, really burn that fuel pretty efficiently and evenly over the course of the race, and that helps my performance. But again, like I come out of it just like night and day difference from my first like several marathons.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah,
I think that summary that we've gone through there. Well, let me try and summarize it, because I think we've covered a lot of ground there, and you can tell me if I've got the Mario Fraioli recipe for marathon prep down to a T in my mind. But so if we start 3 weeks out. You've got your last long, hard session run. So that's going to be 18, 20 odd miles.
Sure.
Lots of marathon pace, or potentially a half marathon with a block of 10 miles at marathon pace. So that happens 3 weeks out. We're then cutting down, the first thing that happens is we're cutting down the mileage a little bit, and intensity a little bit as well, 80% or so.
Yep. So we're cutting down the overall volume, and what I would call like the density of the workouts. We're still going to do sessions on the same day that we typically would do them, or we've done them for the weeks prior, but we're not going to do quite as much time at intensity.
Got it.
Yeah.
Then the last 2 weeks we're tapering, really. That's when the taper starts. So we're progressively dropping to about 70% of the work, or so if you're healthy. And keeping up a decent calorific volume. We're not trimming away at the eating and drinking too much, because we want to stay resilient and robust and all the rest of it. In the last few days, we're looking at our logistical prep. We're making sure that we've got a checklist for all of the kit we need. Our travel's locked in. We're in the right place. We know what time everything's happening. Expo, don't get sucked in there, or don't spend too much time in there if you can help it. And get yourself to your hotel. Chill day on Saturday. Basically switching off, watching some movies, whatever, to try and psychologically get something in reserve. What we didn't talk about actually, but I'm going to add in because it's worth mentioning, those last 2 days you're eating more carbohydrate. You're having a fairly aggressive carb load, which is a lot of carbs, and stripping out other stuff from your diet. And then moving into race morning, you got your breakfast all laid out and ready and dialed. You get that down with a coffee, and then you've got a mild jog about 30 minutes before the start. Into the race, we're really focused on not going out too hard, controlling the pace, being a little bit under pace, if anything. So rather than say under pace, like a little bit slower than goal pace. Just a little
bit slower. And two, to just tie a fueling aspect into this. If you're burning too hot early on, then that's going to be hard. It's going to just be harder to stay on top of, I think, as the race goes on.
Agreed. And then fueling wise, you've got a gel just before the start. You're carrying a bottle, 16 ounces or so, 500 millilitres of drink. You're getting that plus 2 gels down you in the first hour. Then it's 2 gels plus water, and at the finish. So is that a good summary of?
I think we covered it all.
Yeah. So that's all people have got to do then.
That's it. It's as simple and as hard as that.
As that. Yeah, exactly. And then if you have a good marathon, how do you celebrate?
For me, and I did this after Boston last year, I went out and got a burger and a beer with my buddies, and we had a great time just sharing stories from the day.
And if you have a terrible marathon?
do the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's still going to be good stories, and the burger and the beer, maybe they don't taste quite as good, but they're still going to be fun.
Yeah, good stuff.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me, Andy.
Yeah, no, it's been a really, really interesting conversation. Thanks, Mario.